Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now nearing the end of our third season, and we are just as excited as from the beginning to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen today as we interview experts for today's show in our theme this month of health and environmental impacts of our food production, agriculture, and land use. And today we're going to explore the intersection of food production with economics and environment. Now, food, which is the primary purpose of agriculture, is essential for all living organisms to survive, flourish, and thrive. But for human beings, food goes way beyond the biological needs and has long been an integral part of our social life and our culture. And over the past century, the food system has done very well in producing enough food to outpace our population growth and in reducing the real price of food to make it more accessible to everyone. Indeed, agriculture is an economic engine of our world. It can reduce poverty for 75% of the world's poor who live in rural areas and work mainly in farming. It can raise incomes, improve food security, and benefit the environment, if you will. But there are significant trade-offs for all of us that have become more and more pressing every day. And yet, against this significant contribution of agriculture to the global well-being, the global food system, as currently organized, is not quite doing well for its purpose. It imposes very high environmental and health costs, ranging from greenhouse gas emissions, land degradation, water and air pollution, overdrawn aquifers, and biodiversity loss, all the way to foodborne diseases, the growing antimicrobial resistance, persistent under- and malnourished children, and rising obesity. So, what is the net verdict? Is the global food system adding or subtracting from economics and from monetary value? Well, it's estimated that the value of global agriculture production is just over $5 trillion. And it's estimated that the food system generates 2 to 5 times as much value as farm production itself. We know, for example, that in the U.S., for every $1 spent on food by the U.S. consumer, a mere 11 cents of that is accounted for by economic activity on farms, while the rest accrues to numerous activities associated with transforming, delivering, or increasingly preparing the food Americans enjoy on a daily basis. The same is true in the United Kingdom, where agriculture accounts for only 10% of the value of the food system. And since the after the farm to the on-the-farm ratio of value in the food system is much lower in developing countries, it's estimated that the value of the global food system is roughly $8 trillion, or about 10% of the $80 trillion total global economy. Now, the calculation of environmental and health costs are much less straightforward. And environmental and health costs are not reflected in the current market prices of the associated food commodities that we buy. Nevertheless, these costs are significant and they're growing, and estimates could point to priority challenges as well as trigger important conversations that are needed around policy solutions as well as everyday individual solutions. It's estimated that negative impacts associated with the way the current food system operates are at least $6 trillion, and that's conservatively speaking. And it only accounts for 5 external factors of the current food system that existing studies have been able to put a value to. And those are malnutrition, food loss and food waste, food safety, land degradation, and the greenhouse emissions from current agricultural practices. There are also likely substantial costs associated with other external factors that have not yet been measured or accounted for. So who's going to pay these costs? Well, everyone pays the public health cost of an increase in diet-related diseases through gradually, and sometimes not gradually, increasing taxes. But the substantial cost due to environmental and natural resource damage will primarily be paid for by our future generations as food production becomes much more difficult on a significantly eroded resource base and in a more hostile climate that we're beginning to see. The risk is that some of these costs will continue to rise exponentially, posing a significant threat to future ecological and thus economic stability. Now, these shocking numbers only matter, though, if they can actually motivate us to action. Fortunately, though, technologies and practices already exist, and we're going to talk about some of those later, that can make agriculture and the broader food system more climate smart and more environmentally friendly. The food and agriculture sector is almost entirely under private ownership, and it's composed of an estimated 2.1 million farms, about 950,000 restaurants, and more than 200,000 registered food manufacturing, processing, and storage facilities. And this sector accounts for roughly 1/5 of our nation's economic activity. The food and agriculture sector has critical interdependencies, though, with many other sectors, but particularly the water and wastewater systems, because it depends upon clean irrigation and processed water. Also, the transportation systems for the movement of food, products, and livestock. On the energy sector, to power the equipment needed for agriculture production as well as for food processing, and chemicals, like we talked about last month on our chemical theme shows, for fertilizers and those nasty pesticides used in the production of crops. Now, this is a lot. And today we want to explore why we must all care about the environmental and economic impact of our agriculture and food production systems. And here today to help us unpack and explore some of this are 2 experts that we are very excited that we could get to take time and join us. Today we have Barry Goodwin and we have Julie Howard. Now, Barry is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and Graduate Alumni Distinguished Professor in the Departments of Agriculture and Resource Economics at North Carolina State University. Barry is also a 2018 Holiday Medal recipient, and he's held faculty positions at Kansas State University and Ohio State University. And his research and teaching activities are focused on applied economics, policy, trade, and econometrics, with areas of expertise in agricultural marketing, agricultural economics, and international trade. And Barry has a PhD in economics from North Carolina State. Welcome, Barry. Did I get all of that right?
Yeah, thanks. That's more than enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
And Julie Howard is an independent consultant focusing on food and agricultural system development in the sub-Saharan Africa and related U.S. policies and programs. Julie is a non-resident senior advisor in the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Julie is a director of the World Vegetable Center, which we're going to have her tell us more about that, and served as the first chief scientist in the Bureau for Food Security and senior advisor to the USAID Administrator on Agricultural Research, Extension, and Education. Previously, Julie was CEO of the Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty, and she's been a faculty member at Michigan State University. Julie holds a PhD in agricultural economics, and she was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic. Welcome, Julie, and did I get all of that right?
You did, absolutely. Thank you.
And thank you for taking time again to join us today. Now, I want to start out really briefly before we have to go to a break, though. I want to ask Barry, for most of us, when we think of the deliciousness of our favorite foods or things or eating anything, we never quite get around to thinking in that moment about any kind of detriment or harm that food could possibly cause on our environment. So, Barry, could you tell us about how does the agricultural system that generates this delicious and tasty food impact our environment?
Well, first of all, I mean, anything that we do, any productive activity is going to have some negative effects somewhere in the environment. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I'd say, U.S. farmers are really, what they've done with the land and output is astounding. But like any, activity, there are some costs that are somewhat hidden. And, of course, you mentioned water quality issues and whatnot. And again, farmers are very good stewards of the land. But about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. can be traced back to agricultural production, which 10% is a pretty good bit. And that's really a lot to do with crop cultivation and the actions of soils as they break down over time, and livestock emissions, gases that are emitted as a result of livestock production, and then just combustion of fuel on the farm. It is a very impressive food system. We've achieved so much over the last 50 to 100 years, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And, when we think about the counterfactual, let's be careful to think about, all of the cost and what actually separate what we would like to see from really what is feasible.
Indeed. Thank you, Barry. We're going to need to go to break. But when we come back, though, I want to get you to connect the dots for our listeners as to exactly how crop cultivation causes environmental issues. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Barry Goodwin and Julie Howard. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to today's show on the intersection of food production with economics and environment. And we are back with Professor Julie Howard and Professor Barry Goodwin. And they promise to make us much smarter about all of this. And so before we went to the break, Barry was telling us how some of the ways that the food production system impacts the environment. And one of the things that he mentioned that I want to unpack more is crop cultivation. And Barry, I want you to just connect the dots for people as to exactly how crop cultivation causes environmental harm.
Well, it's traditional ways of cultivation would be to, clear the land and use aggressive tillage of the soils, and organic matter that's left in the soils and decompose and emit, gases that contribute to the greenhouse gas problem, CO2 in particular. That's one way, but, it's important to keep in mind that technologies have changed and most farmers, or to a large degree, at least many, have adopted reduced tillage or no tillage as a production practice to control not just issues about greenhouse gases, but just soil erosion and preserving the water holding capacity of their soils and things like that. So farmers are, as I said earlier, good stewards. They recognize they have a strong interest and economic interest in preserving their assets and the productive capacity of those assets, and they do a good job with it.
What about pesticides?
Well, it's an interesting question you mentioned earlier. chemicals, I guess, that there's been a topic of discussion. And I'll just give you an example of how our thinking can be skewed by this. In the mid-'90s, we have about 180, 90 million acres of corn and soybeans in the U.S., give or take. That might be a little high, but very close to that. Almost all of that is genetically modified crops now. Almost all of it, okay? There's strong economic reasons to do that. And we have fear that's stoked sometimes by the media of the whole idea of frankenfoods and genetic modification and so forth. But the fact is yields have improved immensely because of that. And the need and necessity of using chemicals and spraying pesticides has been greatly reduced as a result of that innovation.
I hate to interrupt you, but I want to make sure that our listeners understand that GMOs have been, even though there are concerns and a lot of scares perhaps put out there about health issues, GMOs are quite beneficial for environmental impacts. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying,
okay.
Yes. And they also have some nutritional benefits in a lot of cases that could be brought to people who need those benefits in other countries.
Well, why is there an attempt to scare us then about GMOs?
I don't know if it's I'd say a concerted attempt to scare us, but, it goes back to different cultural beliefs. Europeans by nature are much more concerned about food adulteration and additives, and GMOs, for the most part, are not allowed, at least indirectly in food products. And I think personally, and I tell my classes, there's still Europeans around who know what true hunger is like after World War II. And something like that changes your perceptions about food. And, there's always, cultural beliefs that feed into this as well. But we still don't have genetically modified food commodities in the European Union now. And, it's where that comes from. It's a complicated question with a lot of answers, but I think
does that mean
most of us have no idea what it's like to be hungry.
Because they don't use GMOs in the European Union, does that mean that they don't? What are they missing that we have for not using it?
Well, I think these environmental benefits are not there, but I wouldn't say that there's hunger or anything like that. But a lot of the former colonial states in sub-Saharan Africa carry over some of the principles still in Europe, and I think they are missing out on some of the nutritional benefits of GMOs. We have to be careful with the technology, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of benefits there that concerns are unfounded about.
Julie, how has the look and productivity of our agricultural system changed or evolved due to, first, economic considerations?
Right. Well, I want to take a step back and sort of how do we arrive at the agricultural model that we have today? And so to understand that we have to kind of go back 60 years, which was sort of like the last huge existential global food crisis that we had in the world. Yeah, we were seeing sort of the specter of famine in South Asia. And people like Paul Ehrlich writing books like The Population Bomb that said, the fight is over. We are not going to be able to increase our agricultural productivity to feed all of these people. And we definitely can't do it by increasing our shipments of food aid. So that was on the table in the 60s and 70s. And so people like Norman Borlaug, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and scientists, his colleagues in Mexico and South Asia, they worked to develop new varieties of staple crops, principally wheat and corn and rice, that produced high yields, worked together with new fertilizers, improved agronomic methods that sort of really pushed back and changed the game on agriculture. So we were able to increase the productivity of crops to not only keep up with population growth, but make it possible for these main staple foods to become cheaper and for caloric consumption to increase for populations. And that model took hold not only in South Asia, but it is the principal model in the U.S. and in Europe. So, but I think where we're standing right now is understanding that that's a very productivity-centric model, right? It's about, how do we get the right varieties, the right fertilizers, the right pesticides, the right inputs to produce as much crop or animal as possible at the lowest possible cost. But we're seeing that that's not really working anymore. So on a number of fronts, right? So global hunger is once again starting to rise. The COVID pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine have only worsened these trends. And so we're seeing right now about a tenth of the planet is undernourished. And that really didn't happen between the 1970s and sort of mid-1995. Everything was going well and then sort of started to drop off the cliff about 5 years ago.
Why so, Julie? What happened that made it drop off the cliff? Or was it just 60 years, it's time for another change, or what?
Right. Well, I think it's because, it's become clearer and clearer that it can't be all about productivity. That a lot of the things that we're trying to address are not resolving the problems that are coming up now. So the same innovations, for example, that made staple crops so cheap and widely available also made diets popular that tend to cause obesity and other preventable diseases. We're seeing that here in the U.S. As well as in higher income populations in the developing world. We also know that many of the agricultural practices that were adopted have made systems less resilient to the climate extremes that we're facing. And they also themselves damage the environment. So if I can unpack it a little bit, food systems are being affected by climate change, rising temperatures, erratic rainfall, increasing droughts. These are all around us. These are already decreasing crop yields. And in turn, our current food systems are worsening environmental degradation and climate change. So globally, agriculture and other food system activities account for about 70% of global freshwater use each year. And every time I read that figure, it's just staggering, 70%. And so Barry said 10% agricultural production on farm contributes to 10% of global greenhouse emissions. But if you add in the system, everything that goes into beyond the farm, but marketing and processing, it's actually 1/3. Sort of agriculture and food systems make up 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. Also, really staggering number. And then finally, I think perhaps the scariest number is our current systems are contributing to about 80% of biodiversity loss. So the inefficient use of inorganic fertilizers, I think Barry mentioned this, is causing nitrate and phosphate runoff. We hear about these red tides and dead zones in rivers and oceans. And so about half of the fertilizer that we use and that we're so important, to boosting productivity in that, that bad area of 60s and 70s, we're using it inefficiently. So those are running off and creating biodiversity issues.
Yeah, and when we talked on this show about urban nature spaces and forest agriculture came up in that conversation a lot too, that it was also contributing to the destruction of forest, just the land use, in addition to, is what you just mentioned, the pesticides as well. So there's a lot going on there. We're going to go to break, and we'll be right back on the other side for more of this very interesting conversation with Julie Howard and Barry Goodwin. Thank you all. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on the intersection of food production with economics and environment. And we're back with Dr. Barry Goodwin with North Carolina State University and Dr. Julie Howard, who's a resident senior advisor in the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you all again for being with us. I want to go back now, though, to Julie and talk about how has what we eat or our diets changed due to the economics of our agriculture and food production system?
Okay, so one of it was a great thing back in the 60s and 70s that you'd be able to produce vastly more quantities of cereal and drive down the cost of rice and wheat and corn. But I think an unanticipated byproduct of that is that, we lost a lot of not only biodiversity, the diversity of our diets, right? So right now we're seeing that we have diets that are heavily focused on cereals, on processed cereal products, on cereals, on snack foods, and especially in higher income countries, on meat consumption. So think about, what cows and chickens eat. They eat, the highly productive cereals. So it's a very cereal-focused diet. And so we now are not consuming an adequate variety of affordable, safe, and nutrient-dense foods like fruits and vegetables and beans, right? And so the consequences for human health, are becoming really clear. As of 2017, IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, calculates that 40% of the world's population, 3 billion people, cannot afford even the cheapest healthy diet. And so in high and low-income countries, we find that consumer food preferences have shifted toward highly processed foods and toward sugar-sweetened beverages, soda, and the like. And in higher groups, the overconsumption of animal sources like meat and eggs and dairy products have been linked to heart disease and diabetes and other diet-related diseases that you talked about at the beginning of the program, is having cost to our own pocketbooks, but also to society's pocketbooks. And in the case of meats in particular, a big environmental cost we're finding.
So just to summarize or to really lay it out for our listeners, is what we eat driven by what agriculture and food production systems produce or grow, or are our wants and our desires and our health needs, do those drive what they grow and produce?
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Yep.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's not just the fact that, we produce oranges, so we're going to consume orange juice. That's not a given, I mean, probably before your time, Bernice and Barry, but not before mine. I remember, the big campaign by the Florida orange growers. Anita Bryan was the spokesperson that really, all of a sudden, in my own household, orange juice appeared on the table every day. And now we're now having some second thoughts about that because it's so highly sugared. So it's a lot of consumer influencing consumer preferences. Bob Perlberg, in his recent book, lays a lot at the feet of corporations who have become so skilled at branding and advertising and wanting us to consume the latest wonderful flavor of snack chip, that people are really driven to consume unhealthy foods. So, it's really important to understand that it's not just, we produce it and we have no control over what we eat. So consumer preferences, consumer demand, I think, are one of the most important instruments, for changing our food systems, for changing our health, for changing what farmers and livestock producers produce to satisfy our consumer demands. So if we ask, for example, if we ask for more fruits and vegetables, and you're beginning to see that in some areas, that's going to come up. You're seeing now in some of the food deserts that we see in urban areas, you're starting to see more fruits and vegetables appear. That's because people are buying them.
Now, Barry, I know that one of your areas of interest and expertise is agricultural marketing. So what does agricultural marketing do, and how does this marketing, again, affect what is grown or produced? Well,
before we go into that, I think it's important to say a little bit about policy here. We have in the U.S. a massive farm bill omnibus package of programs. Every 5 years it's renewed. Congress is having the discussions right now about the 2023. After the midterm elections, it'll really heat up. But a lot of what happens in agriculture is driven by policies. You really need to, this is sort of a broader issue, but just to lay it out there, U.S. farmers, by and large, and we don't want to generalize, there's exceptions to everything, but they're a relatively wealthy slice of society, okay? They're very, very good at their business. They're effective small businessmen, but they're very wealthy too. And their incomes are much higher than non-household incomes. That's a big change that it used to be not like that at all. And during the Great Depression, non-farm households had twice the income of farm households. Now it's flipped. It's not twice, but the wealth is probably 10 times or more. A lot of what's happening in agriculture is shaped by this policy, the Farm Bill in particular. And you mentioned future burdens on future generations, and I think we need to think about the tax burden that we're passing down the road to future generations. I was taught this economic theory of Ricardian equivalence, that it doesn't matter if you spend money in borrow now or borrow later, you're always going to have to pay it off with future taxes. Well, that requires that we care about future generations, and I'm just not so sure that holds anymore.
Indeed. I hate to interrupt you, Barry, let me ask you, you mentioned a lot of what goes on is shaped by policy, and I need you to unpack this so our readers can understand it. Give us an example of a policy and connect the dots for us about how it affects what's on our plates.
Well, the biggest program right now is the federal crop insurance program. That sounds like a great idea. We give subsidies to farmers, subsidized insurance to help them manage risk. But think about that for a second. What does that do? It encourages production in risky areas because farmers no longer are facing that risk. Taxpayers are paying for it. And there's a natural consequence that we have soil erosion.
But what are some, you said manage risk. What are some of those risks?
Everything, weather, pest, anything that's not man-made is covered by federal crop insurance, and almost 90% of farm acreage is covered by that program now. But you, the taxpayer, are paying 65% of the premium for farmers, and then all of the overhead and costs that go with that.
What does it get us?
Protection from risk, and it gives bankers faith that their loans are going to be repaid. Those are two big beneficiaries.
What about me and listeners? What does it get? What does it do for ordinary people in their everyday lives?
Well, so the argument would be that these policies ensure a safe and stable food supply. It's an important national defense argument. Yes, probably it contributes to that. But the counter to that is, would we not have a safe, reliable food supply without the federal crop insurance program? No, I don't think that follows at all. It's a subsidy that's paid out, and a lot of the subsidy dollars now are captured by landowners who don't farm. The farmers aren't getting those subsidy dollars necessarily, and it's costing us a lot. And there's a big incentive in the administration right now to throw some subsidies out to address environmental concerns.
Indeed. Thank you, Barry. I need to interrupt you here, and we just got a few minutes to go, and I know that Julie is trying to weigh in.
Yeah, great. I just wanted to follow up on Barry's really good comments that I think, not only in the U.S. but globally, repurposing the agricultural subsidy packages that we have is just a tremendous opportunity. So United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization recently released a report and analysis that said that governments globally provide $540 billion in support to agriculture each year. And they estimate that 90% of those subsidies go to practices that are damaging to the environment and human health. So there is an opportunity so how do we change those policies, not only crop insurance, but lots of other things to adapt to the changing circumstances of agriculture. So one of those ways, if I could just say, is basically more attention to a more diverse set of crops. For example, you asked earlier about vegetable research, fruit and vegetable research. Fruit and vegetable research currently gets 2% of total public agricultural research funds right now. It's astonishingly low when we're saying that people can't afford a decent diet, people can't afford to buy those things. So we clearly need to invest more in research and as well as infrastructure. So there are lots of opportunities.
Let me just say, Julie, that is one area that returns about 10 times the amount that it costs is research. And the share of tax dollars that's going to that, as you said, is decreasing all the time. It's one area where we get so much out of the money that's spent.
Yeah. Particularly our land-grant universities like North Carolina State, my alma mater, Michigan State.
Yeah, and we have 1 minute to go. And when we get back, I want to talk more about what you just said, Julie. There's a disconnect Our tax dollars are paying all these millions and millions to subsidize, yet it's not getting us where we need to go in terms of health and environment. Where is the disconnect? We'll be right back on the other side with more of this very interesting conversation. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, Sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show on the intersection of food production with economics and environment. And we are back with Barry Goodwin and Julie Howard, and they really are making us much smarter about this whole system involved to get and before the food gets to our plates. And before we went to the break, both Barry and Julie had made mention of all the millions of dollars that are subsidizing our food system. And for most of us, we thought that subsidies are for the purpose of guiding things to a wanted or needed public purpose, which I have to think that when these subsidies began, there was some needed beneficial public purpose. Well, but now there seems to be a big disconnect. We are constantly hearing, and I think society as a whole has really internalized that we are what we eat and that the quality of what we eat really does determine and guide our health. Yet subsidies are not being directed in that way. What happened?
Yeah, so, I think government programs carry a substantial amount of inertia. I don't know if Barry will agree with that. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. When they were set up, they had it. There was a different system, a different set of problems confronting us. And now with climate change and nutrition and health issues, now we have the evolution of problems, and the policy environment simply hasn't caught up. So, but as I said, there's a tremendous opportunity for us to repurpose that money in ways that's not, farmers are not the enemy here. Yeah, Barry pointed out, and I believe this too. Farmers try their best to be stewards of the land, but they use the tools that are given them. And one of those tools are policy programs, right, and subsidies. So, I think it's really important for all of us, not only farmers, but the constituents. Yeah, contact your congressperson, right, as they are putting together this farm bill and say, hey, we need a different kind of food system in the U.S. and, in fact, globally. Yeah, I make the same arguments to USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So, Bernice, one of the hopeful things that I see here is that people are starting to wake up to these issues, and they are starting to raise their voices. In fact, I think I have a lot of hope in the next generation, because they're going to be, the rest of us sort of have problems imagining what's going to happen beyond our lifespans, but they are already being affected. They can see 20 years down, 10 years from now, they are going to be affected by rising seas, climate changes. So they are the ones who have the motivation to address this. So they're already starting to drive important consumer behavior changes and policy changes. I was looking at an article the other day that said the rapid rise of non-dairy milks like oat milk and soy milk in the UK is totally driven by young adults aged 16 to 24 who are doing this because they say, dairy has an outsized impact on the environment. We're not doing regular dairy anymore. We're doing plant-based foods.
Indeed. I think also some of the changes we're seeing, well, youth particularly, because they're affected by probably more than the rest of us, but health issues. Like I have to do plant-based milk and cream for my coffee, and it's a health issue for me. The lactose or whatever it is, I can't do milk. I feel it right away. And I know a number of people like that, and probably more so youth, because they grew up on the more, I don't know if we say environmentally impacted crops that cause some of those health issues. And that's why I see that kind of as a circular pattern. But I want to go back briefly to Barry, because I know that you're into policy a lot. How does current agricultural policy affect agriculture-related environmental issues, Barry?
Well, just in every way conceivable. Let me say, you asked why we have these policies in the first place. And I said, in the Great Depression, the first Farm Bill was 1933. Farm households made less than 50% of what non-farm households. It's worked. It was successful. But once you get a policy in place, it's very hard to ever take it away, take those benefits back. And we can see it with the Farm Bill. But we are subsidizing, encouraging production. You know, ethanol production is a big part of policy now. And that's touted as having some environmental benefits, which it does in some sense. But, you know, I think the next Farm Bill, after it's passed, we're still going to have 90 million acres of corn in the U.S. It is targeted toward the main commodities. The specialty crops are tacked on at the end. And, you know, I hate to end on a cynical note, but our representatives care about us, but they care about getting reelected.
And I need to ask you one thing. How should ordinary people in their everyday lives care about the Farm Bill?
Well, again, you know, we all, it goes back to some sort of vague Jeffersonian ideal. We all respect the U.S. farmer, and with good reason, I think. But these subsidies really are distorting things, and we are paying large subsidies. It's not with a B, billion. It's just under $1 trillion scored over 10 years. We're talking some real money. And a lot of that is going to very wealthy individuals. Look, the SNAP programs have been enormously successful. As Julie mentioned, there are nutritional concerns. We wanted to get more calories out there in the 60s. We did too well. And research falls into this bucket as well. It's just unfortunate that I see what we call the Title I programs and crop insurance being sort of still the major focus of our policy.
I know. So you're saying, and again, we've got to get it, you know, as they talk about in elections, kitchen table issues, because that is what makes all of us care and move. And you're saying that we're paying these large subsidies to enrich folks, but we're not getting the value that we need in terms of healthy foods and in terms of productivity that could be, is what I hear you saying. But I want to...
Let me give you just one quick example. We have, I think it's about $40 billion or so in conservation subsidies. And they're effective at reducing water quality issues and soil erosion. We have on the other side of that crop insurance programs that put fragile land back into production, and they have offsetting effects. Now, from a policy perspective, there's questions there, I think.
It is. But again, our key is to put it in a way or that ordinary people understand it, because only when we understand can we move forward. But I hear you saying, and Julie had said before, too, we really do need to talk about it and engage with our public officials. Two things I do want to talk about, and that is right now, Julie, we are seeing our grocery prices increase by leaps and bounds. So what do you see as the cause of this?
Okay. Are you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. Yeah. I mean, first of all, we saw global food prices start to rise with the pandemic in mid-2020. Businesses shut down, straining supply chains. This happened both nationally and globally, shortage of labor. And then since then, we've seen problems with key crops in many parts of the world. Brazil, the top soybean exporter, suffered from severe drought last year. China's wheat crop has been among the worst ever this year. So some countries, because they were worried about their own food supplies, who would traditionally be exporters, have hoarded their exports. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in late February also dramatically worsened the outlook for food prices. So not only wheat, but also fertilizer, and that's the center of production for fertilizer, the close down of the ports. Indonesia, banned most exports of palm oil in spring. I think it's loosened a little bit. All these things have contributed to just, bumps. And so we've also seen, and Barry may want to talk about this as well, the over-concentration of many aspects of our supply chain has caused us problems during COVID and beyond. So, for example, over-concentration of meat processing industry. Yeah, we saw big problems during the pandemic, with one meat packing, to supply a big proportion of product out. When it closed, it impacted supplies nationwide. The same thing with infant formula. So we're learning from that, that it's not just efficiency and concentration, but the importance of diversification and resilience, and thinking, I think, about how policies can reward a kind of redundancy of systems to help instill more resilience in the system, because this won't be the last system of bumps. Yeah, this is just the beginning of the ride for us.
Yeah, I hear you saying it was a perfect storm. Last word, Barry, in terms of what you see, do you anticipate that our food prices could ever go back down? And what would make them do that? We just have 1 minute to go.
Yeah, I just say it's not just food is a major driver, and we all feel it. But everything is getting more expensive right now, and inflation is a phenomenon that we hadn't seen for 50 years or more, and it's here and hopefully not to stay. But I end on a positive note, and the best thing we can do with this public money is to invest in research to address all of these problems. Right now, research is being more and more left to the private sector, who does not have the incentives to share the outcomes, and we need some public reinvestment in research.
Indeed. Thank you all so much. We have been with Dr. Barry Goodwin with North Carolina State University and Dr. Julie Howard with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And in this very brief time, they really have made us smarter as to what's going on with that tasty, delicious food on our table. And we will have more of this next week. Thank you all for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening, and join us again next week as we continue our conversations on health and environmental impacts of our food production, agriculture, and land use. Thank you.